Hi, everyone. My name is Evgeny Kralko, and I'm the lead of the integrations team at Acumatica here in Montreal, Canada. And today I will share some interesting things with you regarding the Avalara use tax functionality implementation with Acumatica. Why implement? Okay, as you probably know, in the US, a business is responsible to ensure it's appropriately pays sales tax on all of its taxable purchases. And if a supplier fails to charge sales tax on a taxable purchase, it's the buyer's responsibility to self-assess the tax to accrue the tax liability, file and remit the self-assessed tax to the appropriate taxing authority. This could happen, for example, when a selling company is not registered in another state. So during our discussions with customers, the findings were that some customers never receive bills from other states, so they don't need to assess use taxes. Some customers never confirm the use taxes in their bills, and some other customers are manually using Avalara to know the amount of tax owed to the authority when no use tax is calculated on the original document. As a result, we decided that Acumatica needs to support use taxes in AP bills so we can identify sales taxes and use taxes and provide a way to automatically assess the use taxes of an AP bill when no tax is included. Initially, we considered two main scenarios. The first scenario is when no sales tax is calculated on an AP bill. The second and more complex scenario is when you need to manually enter your sales tax on a bill and compare it to the use tax calculated by AvaTax. Diving deeper, you can split this second scenario into two sub-scenarios when the sales taxes entered on the document are greater or equal and less than the use tax calculated by Avalara. At the first step, we decided to implement the first scenario only because based on our understanding, it's the most common scenario. And with the second scenario, it's not that easy to compare sales taxes and use taxes between each other in all possible cases. But we will definitely consider to implement this second scenario in the future. Now let's talk about the technical implementation. From a dev perspective, as usual, you need to use C#, download Avalara AvaTax NuGet package, and take the Avalara dev guide. For Avalara AvaTax NuGet package, of course, I'm talking about REST client as it's better and it's richer, and actually subclient is deprecated, so do not try to use it. And by the way, a couple of years ago at Avalara Next conference, I was sharing our experience migrating from SOAP to REST, but that's another story. All right, here are four basic API methods we use for Acumatica Avalara integration. Create transaction method to calculate taxes, settle transaction to verify and post a document, commit transaction to commit a document, and void transaction to void a document if needed. To understand everything better, we can look at this transaction state diagram. By the way, let me mention one thing to avoid confusion between transaction and document words. When you create a transaction, the information about that transaction is referred to as a document. You will see many comments or articles that refer to documents rather than transactions. It helps you if you think of the transaction as the API call and the document as the data that is stored on disk. Okay, so as you can see on the diagram, we can call create transaction method with the different types. For sales order, it's just a temporary transaction, while for sales invoice, it will be saved on the Avalara end. Then you can verify it if needed. For example, in Acumatica, we check transaction date, total amount, and tax total. And if something is wrong, you will get an appropriate error message. Commit transaction call is equal to Acumatica release operation. So once the document is released in Acumatica, it will be moved to committed state in Avalara. What about void transaction method? We call it when you reverse or delete a document in Acumatica. Okay, now as basic architecture, I hope is clear, we can move to the use tax implementation. Let's take a look what create transaction method returns. It returns a transaction model class object, which includes the information about taxes calculated on the Avalara side. There you will find the list of taxes applied to your document, transaction summary, as well as a list of taxes applied to every single line, transaction line detail model. For every tax applied, you can get a tax name and tax type values to decide on how to create in your system. From architecture perspective, the main difference between Avalara and Acumatica taxes is that in Acumatica, we have a single tax ID key and tax type is not a part of the key. While in Avalara, the same tax with the same name can be sales or use tax depending on document type and its address. That means in Acumatica, to make it work, we had to create two separate taxes with the different IDs based on the tax type returned by Avalara. Here's a code example explaining how it's implemented on our end. The logic is pretty simple, and we use an additional use suffix at the end of the tax ID to differentiate it with the existing sales tax record using the same name. The method is customizable, and you can override this logic if you don't like it for some reason, or you need some specific behavior based on your workflow. Another challenge we faced was that in Acumatica, there is no difference between use tax and consumer use tax. And there is only use tax type is presented. So we had to implement some additional logic around it and convert both use tax and consumer use tax returned by Avalara to Acumatica use tax. Here's a code example, again, explaining how it's implemented on our end. The same thing, the method is customizable and you can override it or implement some new tax type if you want to. Well, we have talked about why and how to migrate, and now I believe you would like to know what resources are available to you and the time you will likely spend on implementation. Of course, what I've shown is just the tip of the iceberg, but overall, it's really easy to implement use tax calculation in your system, especially if your application architecture and database structure matches Avalara. And for us, the biggest part was spent on requirements. On one hand, we had to communicate with the Avalara team multiple times, to double check everything, to make sure we're on the same page, and so on. On another hand, we try to discuss this functionality with the existing customers to understand their user scenarios and to make sure we will be implementing exactly what they need. I put 2 weeks for one employee here, but honestly, it's even more than that. Then we spent about 3 weeks on software design and development, but this is because, as I mentioned in the previous slides, we faced some mapping issues. And from dev perspective, at the end, we decided to refactor our code a little bit to make it more customizable and be able to include new tax types very quickly in the future, as our existing implementation wasn't ideal. We spent 5 days on testing, manual testing and new auto test. We spent 3 days on fixing bugs. and finally 4 more days for documentation. And again, depending on your application implementation, it can take much less time. So do not hesitate to include this functionality into your product. All right, in this part, I will tell you what to watch out for. I'm confident that our experience will save you some precious time. Generally, there are 3 things we face during our implementation. Confusion between use tax and consumer use tax, the understanding of what should be done on the ERP part, and of course, backward compatibility. Keep in mind, there are 2 types of use taxes, consumer use tax and vendor retail use tax. And consumer use tax is a tax on the purchaser, and it's self-assessed by the purchaser on taxable items purchased where the vendor did not collect either a sales or vendor use tax. The purchaser remits this tax directly to the taxing jurisdiction. Vendor or retailer use tax applies to sales made by a vendor to a customer located outside the vendor state or sales in interstate commerce if the vendor is registered in the state of delivery. Unfortunately, not everything can be done by ERP, and you should find a good balance for your solution. The ERP job is to help review what use tax was supposed to be and what it was. The self-assessment part. The tax amount accrual would still happen in Avalara as documents are committed, but the self-assessment part has to be done by the user when they review what the supplier actually charged and what they should have charged. So just keep that in mind. If use taxes returned by Avalara are being processed as sales taxes in your current implementation, it's always a good idea to give customers a choice. And for example, in Acumatica, we implemented an appropriate calculate in AP drop-down list on the tax zone level. And this field is used to set whether the use tax type returned by Avalara for an AP bill will be processed as sales tax or as use taxes. So this will allow existing customers to process their AP bills as they have been doing or change the behavior, especially with some customization is already implemented on their end. So we won't break their workflow. So that's it for today. Just keep in mind that the road to success is always under construction. Thanks for watching and see you next time.